That night, Conrad Mercer lay face down on the cold concrete floor of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Baltimore. A bullet had gone through his left shoulder. Blood soaked through his vest and pooled black under the streetlight seeping through the door gap. The man who shot him was someone he had called a brother for 20 years. Just months ago, he controlled every port route from Boston to Miami. But tonight, he was crawling inch by inch toward the steel door, and not a single one of the 14 people he had trusted most could be bothered to pick up the phone. One hand reached past the doorframe, then he blacked out. The person who saved him that night was not an ally, not a soldier, not anyone from the empire he had built. It was a woman driving an old pickup truck past the warehouse at 2 a.m, a mechanic who, 4 years earlier, he had quietly saved from bankruptcy with $35,000, then disappeared without leaving his name. She did not know who he was, but she recognized him. That face, the face of the man who had sat in the corner of her garage in the middle of the night. Eyes locked on the door, like he was waiting for someone to come after him. For 4 years she had kept that face in her mind, and tonight, that face was lying right in front of her, on a concrete floor, in a pool of blood. If this story touched you, hit like so more people get to hear it. Share it with someone who once helped you, without asking for anything back. They deserve to know you still remember. And subscribe so you never miss the next story. Tessa Moran didn't think. She pulled the man up onto the bed of the pickup truck with both hands, using the weight of her entire body to pull against the weight of his. He was heavier than she'd expected. She drove back to the garage without turning on the headlights, using only the low beams, following the shortcut behind the old industrial district, a road where she knew every pothole by heart. When she asked, "Hospital?" he shook his head, just one shake, slow but final. She understood. An ordinary person who was hurt would want to go to a hospital. A person who didn't want to go to a hospital was running from something more dangerous than the wound. She dragged him into the back room of the garage, the small room with a folding cot and a sink, where she slept overnight whenever she worked late shifts. She cut through his suit jacket, pressed a clean towel against the wound, then tightened it with a zip tie. Old man Hargrove had taught her how to stop bleeding when she was 19 years old, after a worker in the shop had a metal bar pierced through his forearm. "Press hard, keep it still, don't panic," he'd said. She didn't panic. She kept him alive through the night. The next morning, she called someone Hargrove had once mentioned, a retired doctor who lived 4 blocks from the garage, a man who used to stitch up dock workers without needing to know their names. He arrived within 30 minutes, carrying an old medical bag. He removed the bullet, stitched the wound, took $500 in cash, and walked out the door without looking back. Not one question. Not one curious glance. That was how things worked in this neighborhood, where people survived by not asking questions they shouldn't ask. Conrad lay motionless on the folding cot, breathing shallowly, his face pale. Tessa sat at the reception counter outside, looking into the back room through the half-open door. She knew that face. Not because she knew him, but because she had kept that face in her mind for 4 years. 4 years earlier, a night in November, Tessa was 23 years old, repairing a Ford Ranger for a customer who needed it the next morning. Hargrove Garage was the only garage still lit on the street at 11 o'clock at night. Old man Hargrove had been gone for 2 years. She was running the garage alone. A $35,000 tax debt was pressing down on her neck, and the bank had sent its final notice. She had exactly 21 days before she lost everything. A black sedan stopped in front of the door. The engine gave off a strange knocking sound, the kind Tessa knew well, the sign of a worn connecting rod. The man stepped out of the car, dark suit, clean shoes, straight posture. He didn't look at her first. He looked at the rearview mirror, then at both ends of the street. Only then did he turn to her. "There's something wrong with the engine. Can you fix it?" Tessa looked at the car, looked at the man, nodded. She opened the hood and began checking. The man didn't stand beside her to watch the way ordinary customers did. He walked straight to the corner of the garage, sat down on the old plastic chair beside the tool cabinet, gripping his phone, his eyes fixed on the entrance. For the entire 40 minutes Tessa lay beneath the car. He didn't say a word. Didn't ask how long it would take. Didn't ask the price. He just sat there, eyes never leaving the door, as if he were counting every second and waiting for someone to walk in. Tessa finished the repair. The number 3 connecting rod was worn, and she temporarily replaced it with a spare from storage. She wiped her hands, walked out, and handed him the keys. $200. $80. He took out his wallet, pulled out 3 $100 bills, and placed them on the counter. He didn't take the change. Didn't say thank you. He only nodded, one short nod, then got into the car and drove away. The taillights of the black sedan faded at the end of the street, turned left, and disappeared. Tessa stood at the garage door, watching after him. She didn't think much of it. A strange customer, a late night, an ordinary repair job. She put the money away, turned off the lights, and locked the door. 3 days later, her phone rang. The bank. She braced herself to hear the words, "Final notice," one more time. But the person on the other end said a sentence Tessa had to ask them to repeat twice. The $35,000 tax debt on Hargrove Garage had been paid in full. No payer's name. No contact number. Only one note in the payment file. A garage worth keeping. A mechanic worth remembering. Tessa stood outside the garage, the phone pressed to her ear, and didn't know what to say. She hung up, stood still for a while. Then she opened the banking app, found the note, and took a screenshot. She didn't know the man's name. She had no way to find him. All she had was a face in her memory, and one sentence on the screen of her phone. She kept both for 4 years. Every time she wanted to give up the garage, every time customers were scarce, money was short, or a machine broke down and she didn't have the money to fix it, she opened her phone, looked at that sentence, then got up and kept working. Not because that sentence had magic in it, but because if a stranger believed this garage was worth keeping, then she didn't have the right to abandon it. And now, 4 years later, that stranger was lying on the folding cot in the back room of her garage, with stitches in his left shoulder and breath so shallow it seemed close to going out. Tessa closed her phone. She didn't need to look at that sentence anymore. The man who wrote it was right there in the next room. To understand why Conrad Mercer was lying on the warehouse floor that night, you have to go back 3 generations, to a man named Edmund Mercer, standing on a Boston dock, in worn-down work shoes, and a fleet of 3 trucks. Edmund wasn't born into money. He was born into the smell of diesel and sweat, the kind of smell that clung to the skin of your hands and wouldn't wash clean. He began by hauling freight for small warehouses around the harbor, the kind of freight the big companies wouldn't touch because the profit was too low. But Edmund understood one thing that other people overlooked. Whoever controlled the route controlled the flow of money. He didn't need to own the goods. He only needed to own the road those goods had to pass through. 15 years. From 3 trucks to a fleet of 40. From 1 rented warehouse to 9 storage yards along the East Coast. From a name nobody knew to a name nobody dared ignore. Mercer Maritime Holdings was born. On the surface, a legitimate maritime logistics corporation. Clean paperwork, taxes fully paid, clear contracts. Beneath the surface, it was something everyone in the business knew but no one said aloud. If you wanted freight to move through the East Coast ports from Boston to Miami without trouble, you had to nod to the Mercer family first. Edmund didn't sell contraband. He didn't traffic people. He didn't touch anything that would make the federal government knock on his door. He made money by controlling infrastructure, warehouses, docks, trucking routes, and silence. His rule was so simple he only had to say it once, and Conrad remembered it even now. We control the route, not people. The day you touch illegal cargo, that's the day this family dies. Edmund died of lung disease when Conrad was 25 years old. During those final weeks, he lay in bed in the house in Dorchester, breathing through a machine, speaking slowly, with whole minutes between one sentence and the next. But the last words he said to Conrad weren't slow at all. He gripped his son's hand, looked straight into his eyes, and said every word clearly. You'll meet people who want to turn what I built into something else. When that day comes, you'll have to choose. Keep the principles, or keep the empire. You can't keep both. Conrad was 25 years old, sitting beside his father's bed, and he didn't fully understand. He took over Mercer Maritime and kept that rule for 8 years. For 8 years, he built the corporation 3 times larger than it had been under his father, controlling every major port route from Boston down to Miami, with his own shipping fleet, his own warehouses, and a network of relationships so strong that when he made a phone call, the person on the other end picked up before the second ring. He sat at the head of the table in every meeting, and when he spoke, the room went silent. Not because he shouted, because he didn't need to shout. 2 years before he lay on that warehouse floor, there was a night at the Port of Boston that showed just how frightening Conrad Mercer could be. A group outside the organization used a Mercer port to move an unauthorized shipment. The cargo had already arrived, sitting inside 3 containers in Section 4, with an estimated value in the millions of dollars. When Conrad arrived at the port at 10 o'clock at night, his men were already lined up, waiting for orders. One regional chief suggested charging a port usage fee, turning the incident into a new stream of income. Another suggested taking a cut, keeping 20% of the shipment's value. Conrad stood there, looking at the 3 containers. Then he said, in a voice as ordinary as if he were ordering coffee, "Burn it." No one moved. Burn it all. They burned it. 3 containers. Millions of dollars turned into black smoke, rolling up into the night sky over the port of Boston. Conrad watched from beginning to end, hands in his trouser pockets, his face expressionless. When the last flame died, he turned to the man standing beside him. Grant Hale, his right hand, the man he called brother. Grant was staring at the ashes, and Conrad said, "Anyone who uses my port without asking finds out that whatever they brought here no longer exists. Next time, they'll ask." Grant nodded, but Grant's eyes weren't on Conrad. Grant's eyes were on the ashes, on the millions of dollars that had just turned into air. And inside Grant Hale's mind, a door opened that Conrad never saw. Grant didn't think, "Next time, they'll ask." Grant thought, "If I were sitting in that chair, I wouldn't burn it. I'd take it." Fast forward 2 years. Grant Hale called Conrad at 9 o'clock. His voice was normal, his breathing steady, nothing out of place. Internal meeting, storage yard number 6 at the Port of Baltimore, 10:30. "There's something urgent we need to discuss about the southern route." Conrad didn't suspect anything. The southern route was having problems with the shipping schedule, and he knew that. Grant was the one in charge of the southern route. A late meeting wasn't unusual in their world. Conrad arrived at storage yard number 6 with 2 close bodyguards. The car stopped in front of the warehouse door. The lights inside were already on. The warehouse door was open. He stepped out of the car, straightened his collar, and walked in. 8 regional chiefs were seated around the long table in the middle of the warehouse. 8 men Conrad had personally chosen, personally trained, personally pulled up from the lowest positions in the organization. The man in charge of the Norfolk port area, Conrad had given him his first chance when no one else would even look at him. The manager of the Charleston storage yard, Conrad, had paid his wife's hospital bills when she had surgery 3 years earlier. The Savannah route coordinator, Conrad had stood up for him when he got into trouble with the federal police. 8 men, 8 names, and when Conrad walked in, not one of them stood. In 8 years of leadership, every time Conrad entered a meeting room, everyone stood. Not because it was a rule, because it was respect. Today, all 8 chairs stayed still. All 8 pairs of eyes looked down at the tabletop, and at the head of the table, in the chair where Conrad always sat, Grant Hale was sitting, comfortable, leaning back, both hands resting on the table. Conrad stopped walking. He looked at Grant, looked at the chair, then he looked around the room, slowly, one face at a time. And in that moment, everything came rushing back. The signs he'd ignored for 3 years. The phone calls Grant took at night before stepping outside. The route inspection trips that lasted longer than usual. The regional chiefs who had started calling Grant before they called Conrad. The expenses in the books that Grant explained as operational expansion, but never supported with a specific report. And Delaney, his wife, who had moved her personal assets into a separate trust 2 years earlier, using the excuse of protecting the family estate for Wyatt. 3 years. Grant had spent 3 years buying off each regional chief with money and promises, moving the organization's funds through shell companies, and signing transportation contracts for illegal cargo in Conrad Mercer's name. On paper, Conrad was responsible for everything, and Delaney had known from the beginning. Grant opened his mouth. His voice was calm, as if he were reading minutes from a meeting. "The organization has voted. The result is unanimous. Starting tonight, the Mercer family has a new head." He didn't say, "You've been removed." He didn't need to. The chair he was sitting in had already said it. Conrad stood in the middle of the warehouse, silent. He looked at each regional chief one more time. Norfolk, Charleston, Savannah, Jacksonville, Tampa, Wilmington, Philadelphia, Newark. 8 names. 8 men he had once called family. Not one of them lifted his head. Conrad's 2 bodyguards were forced into the corner of the warehouse by 4 of Grant's men, their arms held, their weapons stripped away. They looked at Conrad, waiting for an order. Conrad shook his head. There was no order left to give. He turned and walked toward the warehouse door. No pleading, no threats, no looking back. His back straight, his steps even, the same way he had walked into every meeting for the past 8 years. That was the last thing he still had left that night, the way he carried himself. He had taken 6 steps out of the warehouse door when he heard Grant say something behind him. He couldn't hear it clearly. Then a shot. Left shoulder. Conrad fell forward, his knees hitting the concrete first, then his whole body going down. He didn't look back to see who fired. He knew. The order could only have come from one man. The same man who had sat beside him the night the money burned at the port of Boston. The same man he had called brother. And that was where he was. Lying on that concrete floor, crawling centimeter by centimeter toward the iron door, one hand reaching outside. When Tessa Moran drove her old pickup truck past, Conrad opened his eyes after 2 days. A low ceiling, peeling paint, a flickering fluorescent bulb, the smell of motor oil and antiseptic mixed together. His left shoulder ached, the kind of dull pain buried deep in the bone, reminding him that everything from that night was real. He was lying on a folding cot in the back room of a garage whose name he couldn't remember, saved by a woman whose face he couldn't remember. The first thing he did was try to sit up. The second was try to stand. The third was walk toward the door. Tessa stood in the doorway, holding a wrench, not to threaten him, only because she had been in the middle of working when she heard movement in the room. She looked him up and down, looked at the way he braced one hand against the wall to keep his balance, looked at the old blood that had soaked into the bandage and dried into a brown streak. Then she said, "You walk outside now. You won't make it to the end of the street." Conrad looked at her, looked at the door behind her, then looked down at his own feet, at the legs that were trembling. He didn't stay because he trusted her. He stayed because she was right. For the next 3 days, Conrad lay on the folding cot and made phone calls. He called one number after another. The number of the Norfolk regional chief, the man he'd given his first chance. Voicemail. The number of the Charleston storage yard manager, the man whose wife's hospital bills he'd paid. Voicemail. The number of the Savannah route coordinator, the man he'd vouched for with the federal authorities. Voicemail. He called Jacksonville, Tampa, Wilmington, Philadelphia, Newark. He even called numbers that weren't on the regional chief's list, people lower down, people he thought might still be loyal. 14 numbers. 14 times the words, "Please leave a message," sounded, and then went dead. Not one person called back, not one message. The phone of Conrad Mercer, the man who had once controlled every East Coast port route, was now quieter than the phone of a dead man. At least a dead man still had people calling to offer condolences. On the 4th day, Conrad sat on the edge of the cot, looking at the phone in his hand. He scrolled through the contacts one more time. 14 names. 14 people. He had built careers for them, paid them money, shielded them from trouble, and not one of them picked up when he needed them. He clenched the phone in his hand, then he threw it. The phone slammed into the concrete wall of the garage, cracked at the corner of the screen, dropped onto the cement floor, and landed face down. The sound of the impact echoed through the garage. Tessa was lying beneath a Civic in the next bay. She slid out, looked at the phone on the floor, looked at Conrad standing in the doorway of the back room with his hand still raised. Then she stood, walked over to the phone, picked it up, and placed it back on the table beside the cot. She didn't say a word. Didn't ask why. She turned around, lay back down beneath the car, and kept working. On the 5th day, Conrad didn't call anyone anymore. He sat in the doorway of the back room, looking out into the garage bay, watching Tessa work. She was removing the transmission from a small truck. Alone, no one helping her. She removed each bolt, placed them on a tray in order, pulled the transmission out, wiped each part clean with a rag, inspected it with her eyes, then put it back together. Every movement was precise, nothing wasted, nothing missing. Conrad had once run an empire, given orders to hundreds of people, signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but he had never seen anyone work with her own hands that way. Completely alone, completely self-sufficient. She didn't need anyone to pick up the phone, didn't need anyone to nod, didn't need anyone to give permission. She picked up a wrench, and her world functioned. He picked up a phone, and his world was 14 rounds of voicemail. The 6th day. The 7th day. Conrad began leaving the back room more often. He stood in the corner of the garage, watching Tessa work, silent, only watching, until the morning of the 7th day, when Tessa crawled out from beneath a car, wiped her hands on a rag, looked at him standing there, and asked, "Do you know how to change oil?" Conrad looked at her, shook his head. "Then start there." She tossed him a wrench, pointed at the Toyota waiting for service in Bay 2, and turned back to her own work. No lecture, no step-by-step instructions. She only opened the oil cap and showed him once, then left him to do it himself. Conrad Mercer, the man who had once signed orders to move an entire fleet of ships, lay under a car for the first time in his life, with a wrench in his right hand, his left arm still hurting too badly to lift, trying to find the oil filter. He looked in the wrong place. He turned it the wrong way. Old oil spilled onto the floor instead of into the drain pan. Tessa didn't come back to check. She let him clean it up himself, and it was there, beneath that Toyota, his hand stained with black oil, his back pressed against the cold cement floor, that Conrad began to talk. Not because anyone asked, not because he wanted to, but because when his hands were busy, his mouth opened on its own. He told it in fragments, broken pieces, out of order. He told her about Grant, about the chair at the head of the table, about the shot behind his back. He told her about Delaney, about the papers, about Wyatt. He spoke between the sound of the wrench striking metal, between the sound of oil dripping into the pan, between the sound of Tessa turning bolts in the next bay. She didn't turn toward him, didn't comment, didn't comfort him. She listened by continuing to work, and Conrad spoke by continuing to search for the oil filter he still hadn't managed to remove. That night, Conrad slept in the back room, his breathing steadier than it had been in the first few days, the stitches in his shoulder beginning to heal. The garage lights were off, with only the small desk lamp at the reception counter casting out a pool of yellow light. Tessa sat at the counter, not sleeping. She often stayed awake late, a habit from when she was little, lying in rooms that weren't hers, in houses that weren't her home, beside people who weren't her family. On those nights, she learned that sleep was when a person was most vulnerable, so she got used to staying awake. She was 27 years old now, and she still hadn't been able to break that habit. She opened the drawer beneath the counter, the last drawer on the left, the one no one knew about except her. Inside was a small tin box, the kind used to hold breath mints, its paint almost completely chipped away, its lid slightly bent. She set the box on the counter and opened it. Inside were two things. The first was a plastic hospital bracelet, the kind nurses fasten around a newborn's wrist the moment the child enters the world. The plastic had yellowed, and the printed letters had faded, but they could still be read, Tessa Moran. No mother's name beside it, no father's name, only her name, alone on the bracelet, just as she had been alone from the very first day. The second was a Polaroid photograph, the instant kind, its corners curled, its colors faded. In the picture, a 10-year-old girl was holding a 2-year-old boy. The girl was Tessa. The boy was Cody, her younger brother. In the photograph, Tessa was smiling, the smile of a 10-year-old child trying to hold tightly to the only thing that belonged to her. Cody was looking up at his sister's face, one hand gripping Tessa's collar, the way children hold on when they're afraid of being let go. That was the only picture of the two siblings. No one took a second one. Two things, a plastic bracelet and a photograph. Tessa Moran, 27 years old, with her entire past fitting inside a tin box the size of her palm. No thick family album on a bookshelf. No wedding photograph of her parents hanging on the wall. No old house to drive past every holiday and say, "I grew up here." No smell of her grandmother's baked pies. No tree in the front yard where her father marked her height every year. The things people called childhood memories. Tessa didn't have them. She had a tin box. She looked at the bracelet, looked at the photograph, looked at 2-year-old Cody's face as he gripped her collar. Then, she closed the lid of the box, gently, placed it back in the drawer, and pushed the drawer in. She didn't cry. Tessa didn't cry over these things. She had looked at them too many times to still be able to cry. She cried the first time when she was 12 years old, the night Cody was moved away. She cried the second time when she was 18 years old, the night she left the last house. After that, she didn't cry anymore. Not because she was strong, but because tears needed someone to see them in order to mean something, and Tessa had no one to see. She stood up, walked to the door of the back room, and looked in through the narrow opening. Conrad lay on the folding cot, his face turned toward the wall, breathing evenly. A man who had once controlled every East Coast port route was now curled up on a folding cot in the back room of a mechanic's garage. She looked at him and understood why she had pulled him into her truck that night. Not because she recognized his face, not because of $35,000, but because she knew exactly what it felt like to lie in the dark with no one in the world knowing where you were. She had lain that way for hundreds of nights. She couldn't step over someone lying like that and keep driving. Conrad had been at the garage for 2 weeks. The wound in his shoulder had begun to heal, and he could move his left arm now, though it still hurt whenever he reached too high. He had learned how to change oil, remove an air filter, and begin telling which engine sounds were normal and which ones meant trouble. He was starting to get used to the rhythm of life inside the garage. Slow, repetitive, with no one calling, no one waiting for orders. Then one afternoon, he stepped out of the garage to buy food at the grocery store 2 blocks away. When he came back, Delaney was standing on the sidewalk in front of the garage. She stood there as if she were standing before a courthouse, back straight, leather handbag on her shoulder, hair neatly done, face expressionless. She wasn't dressed like a woman visiting her wounded husband. She was dressed like an attorney meeting a client. Conrad stopped 3 meters from her. He didn't ask how she knew he was here. He didn't ask who had told her. He only looked at her, and the first thing he felt wasn't longing, wasn't anger, but exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that belongs to a man who has already been stabbed once and is now looking at the second knife. "I need you to sign a few papers," Delaney said. Her voice was normal, the same voice she used every morning when she told him to sign the utility bills. "To protect the assets for Wyatt. If the assets are frozen because of Grant's case, Wyatt won't have anything. I need you to sign a power of attorney so I can move our shared assets into a protective trust for our son. Wyatt." She used Wyatt's name. Conrad hadn't seen his son in 2 weeks, hadn't heard his voice, didn't know whether the boy had asked where his father was. And now Delaney stood in front of him, saying his son's name, holding out a stack of papers. Conrad looked at the papers. Thick, small print, the kind of paperwork he would normally have handed to a lawyer to read first. But his lawyer wasn't picking up the phone anymore. And Delaney was the lawyer. She drafted contracts better than anyone he had ever hired. He knew that because he had lived with her for 5 years. "Let me see Wyatt," Conrad said. "Once you sign, I'll arrange it," Delaney answered. "Not a promise, a condition." Conrad stood on a suburban Baltimore sidewalk, his left shoulder still hurting, his right hand holding a bag of groceries, and his wife was handing him a pen. He signed. He signed because Delaney said Wyatt's name, and when a father isn't allowed to see his child, he'll sign anything with that child's name on it. He didn't read all of it. He signed on the lines Delaney pointed to, with his left hand as he always did, then handed the papers back to her. Delaney slipped the papers into her bag, clipped the pen back in place, and said, "Take care of yourself." Then she turned, walked to the car parked at the end of the street, got in, and drove away. She didn't ask how his wound was, didn't ask how he was living, didn't look back. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at the garage by mail. Recipient name: Conrad Mercer. Address: Hargrove Garage, the exact address only Delaney knew he was staying at. Inside the envelope was the divorce decree from the Baltimore County Court. The papers Conrad had signed on the sidewalk that day weren't a power of attorney to protect assets for Wyatt. They were documents transferring full ownership of all joint marital property into Delaney Cross's name, including the house, the accounts, the cars, and temporary custody of Wyatt Mercer, 5 years old. Delaney had drafted those papers before coming to the garage. She had known exactly that he would sign without reading, because she knew exactly which word would make him sign. That word was Wyatt. Tessa stood in the service bay, 4 steps from the reception counter, watching Conrad stand at the counter with the decree in his hand. She saw him read, saw his eyes stop on some line, saw his jaw tighten. Then she saw him fold the paper slowly, once in half, then into quarters, and slip it into his back pocket. He walked past her, went into the back room, and closed the door. No throwing, no smashing, no shouting. The door closed softly, the way a door closes when the person behind it has nothing left with which to react. Tessa stood there, looking at the closed door. She didn't knock. She turned back to the service bay, lay down under the Camry waiting for a brake replacement, and kept working. There were some kinds of pain no one could heal by knocking on a door and asking, "Are you okay?" Tessa knew that better than anyone. 4 days after the divorce envelope, they came. 2 men, one tall, one short, both wearing jackets even though it wasn't cold. The kind of jackets people wore when they wanted to hide something inside. They parked at the end of the street and walked to the garage at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, in the middle of the day, in broad daylight, as if they didn't need to hide anything at all. Tessa was standing at the reception counter, checking a parts order. Conrad was in the back room, resting because his left shoulder had started hurting again after a morning spent trying to reach up and remove an air filter mounted too high. The tall man came in first. He looked around the garage once, looked at each service bay, looked at the door to the back room, then looked at Tessa. "We're looking for someone. A man, somewhere in his 30s, possibly injured. Has anyone like that come through here?" Tessa looked straight into his face. She didn't look toward the back room door, didn't glance, didn't blink. She looked straight at him, the way someone looks when she's used to facing questions where the true answer would cause trouble. "I fix cars, not people." The short man stepped forward, looking more carefully inside the garage. He looked at the folding cot propped up in the corner, looked at the large men's shoes beside the back room door. Tessa saw his eyes stop on the shoes. She went on, her voice unchanged. "If your car has a problem, I can help. Anything else I can't." The 2 men looked at each other. The tall one nodded. They turned and walked back toward the car at the end of the street. Tessa stood at the counter until the car disappeared from view. Then she went straight into the back room, closed the door, and locked it. Conrad was sitting on the folding cot, eyes open, back against the wall. He had heard everything. The back room and the garage bay were separated by only a thin wall. Tessa's hands were trembling. She put both hands on her knees to steady them, but Conrad had already seen. He looked at her hands, then looked into her eyes. "I'll leave. I shouldn't be here." Tessa looked at him. "Where will you go?" Conrad opened his mouth. No answer came out, because there was nowhere to say. Not a hotel, because he didn't have clean papers. Not friends, because 14 people had already proven that. Not family, because his family had just mailed him a divorce decree. "Then sit down," Tessa said. She unlocked the door, stepped back outside, returned to the service bay, and kept working. Her hands still trembled for another 10 minutes before she could hold the wrench steady. 2 weeks later, the second time came. This time was different. Conrad wasn't at the garage. He had started going out more often, and that night he had gone out to clear his head, leaving Tessa alone at the garage. At 9 o'clock at night, she had locked the front door, turned off the outside lights, and left only the desk lamp at the reception counter on. She was doing the books, adding up the cost of this month's parts, when she heard a knock on the glass door. It wasn't the knock of a customer. Customers knocked with their knuckles, quick and light. This knock came from a whole fist, slow and steady, the kind of knock made by someone who wasn't asking permission, but ordering the door to open. Tessa turned off the desk lamp. The garage sank into darkness. Through the glass door, she saw 2 figures standing outside. Maybe the same 2 men from before. Maybe someone else. She couldn't see clearly. She didn't need to see clearly. She walked to the tool cabinet, opened the bottom drawer, and took out the largest wrench she owned, the kind used for heavy-duty trucks, weighing nearly 2 kilograms, almost half a meter long. It wasn't used for any car in her garage. She held it with both hands, stood behind the counter, and looked out at the glass door. She didn't call the police. She had grown up in houses where when you called the police, they came 40 minutes later, and by then everything had been over for a long time. She didn't call Conrad. He was somewhere out in the night, and his phone wasn't something she wanted ringing right now. She stood there, alone, in the dark, holding the wrench, watching the 2 figures outside the glass door knock 3 more times, then circle around the garage, look through the side window, return to the front door, and stand there a while longer. 40 minutes. Tessa Moran stood for 40 minutes behind the reception counter of the garage, holding a 2-kilogram wrench, not moving, not shaking, not breathing hard. This time, her hands didn't tremble. The first time, her hands had trembled because she was afraid for Conrad. This time, she was afraid for herself. And that kind of fear didn't make her hands shake. That kind of fear made her grip tighter. They left. Tessa heard the footsteps fading, the engine starting at the end of the street, then silence. She stood there for 10 more minutes to be sure. Then she set the wrench on the counter, sat down in the chair, and breathed out. Conrad came back to the garage at 11 o'clock at night. He entered through the back door, the door Tessa had left unlocked for him. He walked past the reception counter and saw the wrench. It lay on the counter beside the ledger and the ballpoint pen, a wrench meant for heavy-duty trucks, lying on the reception counter of an ordinary auto repair garage. He stopped, looked at the wrench, looked at Tessa sitting in the chair, eyes open, still awake. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to ask. After 8 years sitting at the head of the table in the world he had once lived in, Conrad Mercer knew how to read the things that weren't spoken. A wrench of the wrong size, lying in the wrong place, at the wrong hour, had only one meaning. The next morning, Conrad got up at 6 o'clock. He drove Tessa's pickup truck to a hardware store 15 minutes away and bought 3 new locks, the industrial kind used for storage yards. He installed all 3 on the garage's front door before Tessa woke up. When she came out to the counter at 7 o'clock, she saw 3 bright new locks on the old iron door. Conrad was sweeping the floor in bay one. She looked at the locks, looked at Conrad. Didn't ask. He didn't explain. Some conversations happen entirely through locks and wrenches. 1 week after the night of the 3 locks, Conrad realized the lift was no longer in bay 3. The 2-ton hydraulic lift, the most important piece of equipment in the garage, the one thing without which they couldn't raise a car to repair the undercarriage, replace the brakes, or inspect the exhaust system. Conrad knew that lift was still working well because he himself had serviced it the week before, changing the hydraulic fluid, checking the valves, wiping every part clean the way Tessa had shown him. He asked Tessa, "Where's the lift?" Tessa was writing an invoice at the counter and didn't look up. "It broke. I had someone haul it away for repairs." Conrad looked at her. She kept writing, her handwriting even, her hand not trembling. But Conrad had lived long enough in a world where people lied to know when an answer came too fast, too neatly, and avoided the eyes too carefully. That lift wasn't broken. That lift had been sold. He didn't ask anything more then, but he started paying attention. The next week, the wheel alignment tool set disappeared. Tessa said she had lent it out. The week after that, the small air compressor was no longer in the corner of the shop. Tessa said she had sent it out for maintenance. Every week, the garage lost one more thing, and every week Tessa had a different reason, each one reasonable if heard by itself. But when placed in a row, they meant only one thing. She was selling off the garage piece by piece. Conrad found out. He didn't ask Tessa, because she wouldn't tell him the truth. He asked the owner of the parts store at the end of the street, the man who sometimes bought used equipment from garages in the area. The man said yes. Tessa had sold the lift the week before, $8,000, almost half below market price, a rushed sale. Conrad asked why. The man said he didn't know, only that Tessa had needed cash the same day. Conrad asked around some more. Piece by piece, the picture came together. Tessa had a younger brother named Cody, 21 years old. The 2 siblings had grown up together in the foster system but had been separated when Tessa was 12 and Cody was 6. Cody was sent to a new family in another state. Tessa stayed in Maryland, passing through 3 more families before she aged out of the system at 18. 12 years. Tessa searched for Cody for 12 years. 12 years of calling agencies, writing letters, searching online, asking every old contact she knew from the system, following each faint lead until she lost it, then finding another one and searching again. She found him when Cody had just turned 18, working as a kitchen helper at a small restaurant in Richmond. She drove 4 hours there, stood outside the restaurant door, looked in through the glass, and saw a young man whom it took her several seconds to recognize as the 2-year-old child in the Polaroid photograph. She brought Cody back to Baltimore, let him live with her, let him work in the garage. 3 years. For 3 years, the siblings lived beside each other. Tessa taught Cody how to fix cars. Cody learned quickly, his hands were skilled, and for the first time in Tessa's life, she had someone to cook dinner with. But Cody, at 21, wasn't the 4-year-old child Tessa remembered. He carried 12 years that Tessa hadn't been there for. 12 years in strangers' houses. 12 years of growing up on his own without his sister. He carried habits Tessa didn't understand, friends Tessa didn't know, and bad decisions Tessa couldn't stop. Cody owed $40,000. A debt to a street loan crew, the kind where borrowing was easy, but repayment was never enough, because the interest kept piling on top of itself. Cody owed because of bad decisions he didn't want to explain, and Tessa didn't ask about. Tessa knew. She knew from the moment Cody started coming to work late, dark circles under his eyes, his phone ringing over and over, while he refused to answer. She didn't ask. She sold the lift. She sold the tools. She sold one thing after another in the garage old man Hargrove had left her, just to slowly pay down the debt of the little brother she had spent 12 years trying to find again. One evening, Cody came to the garage. 9 o'clock. The garage was closed. Conrad was in the back room. Tessa was mopping the floor in Bay 1, dragging the mop back and forth across the cement, steady, rhythmic, the way she did every night. Cody stood in the doorway. He didn't come in. He stood on the threshold, both hands hanging at his sides, head lowered, like a person trying to say something and not knowing where to begin. Tessa didn't stop mopping. Tess, I'm sorry. I know you sold the lift. Tessa dragged the mop from left to right to left to right. She didn't look at Cody. She looked at the floor. Then she said, her voice level, neither rising nor falling, the voice of someone controlling every word, because if she let go, everything would break. When you were moved to that new family, I was 12 years old. I wasn't allowed to say goodbye. I only looked through the window and watched the car drive away. I searched for you for 12 years. 12 years, Cody. You think I'd let $8,000 matter more than you? Cody cried. He stood in the garage doorway and cried, the way a 21-year-old cries, without sound, only his shoulders shaking, and tears running down his chin, dripping onto the cement floor Tessa had just mopped. Tessa didn't cry. She set the mop down and leaned it against the wall. She walked to the door, took her brother by the wrist, and pulled him into the garage, the way someone pulls a child inside when rain is about to fall. Sit down. Tomorrow morning, Mr. Mercer will show you how to change oil. Cody sat down on the plastic chair in the corner of Bay 1, the same chair Conrad had sat in during those first days. He wiped his face with his sleeve. Tessa turned back, picked up the mop, and kept mopping. The garage floor had been clean for a long time already, but she kept mopping, because her hands needed to hold on to something, and the mop was the closest thing there. The next morning, Conrad taught Cody how to change oil, exactly as Tessa had said he would. He explained it slowly, patiently, didn't shout when Cody turned something the wrong way, didn't sigh when the oil spilled onto the floor. He only said, "Do it again," then handed him a rag. While Cody was lying under the car, Conrad asked quietly, his voice as ordinary as if he were asking about the size of the oil filter, "Who do you owe?" Cody didn't answer right away. Then he said, just as quietly, in the voice of someone who had been hiding too long and was tired of hiding, "Pinnell's crew, 40,000. Conrad knew that name, not because he had ever worked with Pinnell, but because in the world Conrad had lived in for 8 years, he knew the name of every crew operating within a 50-mile radius of Baltimore, knew who lent money, who collected debts, who controlled which street corner. Pinnell ran a street loan crew in East Baltimore, small in scale, but vicious. The kind of crew that, when a debtor fell behind, didn't call with a reminder. They came to the house. Conrad said nothing more to Cody. He stood, washed his hands, changed his shirt, and walked toward the door. Tessa was replacing the air filter in Bay 2. She looked at him as he walked out, looked at the way he moved. Back straight, steps even. Different from the way he moved around the garage every day. Most days, he walked like a mechanic looking for a wrench. Today, he walked like someone else. She didn't ask where he was going. Conrad drove Tessa's pickup truck to East Baltimore. He found Pinnell's place, an abandoned laundromat with a back room where Pinnell met people. He parked in front, stepped out, and walked in. Alone, carrying nothing but his name. 2 men at the door looked at him. He looked back, with the kind of look that 8 years at the head of the table had carved into his eyes. The kind of look that didn't need to say, "I'm dangerous," because the eyes had already said it. They let him in. Pinnell was sitting behind a desk. A man in his 40s, hair cut short, a gold chain around his neck, counting cash. He looked up when Conrad sat down in the chair across from him without being invited. "I'm Conrad Mercer," Conrad said, his voice flat, neither rising nor falling, the voice of a man who hadn't come to beg. "The boy named Cody owes you 40,000. Starting today, that debt belongs to me, and you know how I repay debts." Pinnell stopped counting money. The name Mercer wasn't a name people heard in East Baltimore every day, but it was a name everyone in the business knew. The family that had controlled every East Coast port route for 3 generations. People could knock Conrad out of his chair, but the Mercer name hadn't been knocked out with him. That name still carried the weight of 30 years of connections, 30 years of grudges and favors, 30 years of people in the business owing that family something they hadn't yet finished repaying. Touching Conrad Mercer, even a Conrad Mercer who was fixing cars in a suburban garage, still meant touching a name whose consequences no one could fully calculate. Pinnell looked at Conrad, looked into those eyes, looked at the way he sat, back straight, both hands on the desk, not hurried, not tense, as if he were sitting in his own living room. Pinnell knew the difference between a man who came there because he was afraid and a man who came there because he had nothing left to fear. Conrad Mercer belonged to the second kind, and the second kind was far more dangerous. Pinnell opened a drawer and took out Cody's debt note. He looked at the paper, looked at Conrad, then tore it in half, tore it into quarters, placed the pieces on the desk. Conrad stood, nodded once, turned his back, and walked out. No handshake, no thank you, no looking back. He drove back to the garage, parked in the same old spot, went inside, changed clothes, lay down beneath the Accord in Bay 1, and started fixing the brakes, as if he had just gone out to buy coffee, not wiped out a $40,000 debt with 6 sentences and a name. Tessa found out because Cody told her. He ran back to the garage that afternoon, eyes red, breath uneven, stood at the entrance to Bay 1, and said, "Tess, they cleared the debt. Mr. Mercer went to see them this morning." Tessa stood at the counter, looked at Cody, then looked into Bay 1, where Conrad's legs were sticking out from beneath the car, his shoes stained with oil, the wrench tapping against the brake bolt. She walked to Bay 1, stood beside the Accord, looked down. Conrad was lying under the car, eyes fixed on the brake system, his right hand holding the wrench, his left hand holding the line. His hand was stained with black oil, the hand that had once signed orders to move an entire fleet of ships. The hand that morning, had erased a $40,000 debt simply by sitting down and saying his own name. Tessa knelt beside the underside of the car. She reached out and placed her hand on the back of Conrad's left hand, the hand still weak from the wound in his shoulder. She placed it there gently, not holding, not squeezing, only resting it there. The motor oil on his hand smeared onto hers. She didn't pull away. It was the first time she had touched him since the night she pulled him up into the pickup truck, the night her hands had been stained with his blood instead of motor oil. Conrad stopped moving. The wrench went still. He didn't look over. She didn't say anything. And the two of them stayed there, beneath an old Honda Accord, in a garage outside Baltimore, one hand resting on another, with nothing more needed. 3 days after the Pinnell incident, the garage was wrecked. They came at night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, when both Conrad and Tessa were asleep in the back room. No one heard anything until the sound of breaking glass woke Conrad. He sat up sharply, his left shoulder flaring with pain, and heard more sounds, metal striking metal, tools crashing onto the floor, oil spilling. He went to the back room door, opened it just a crack, and looked out. At least 3 figures were smashing the service bays, using crowbars to break open the tool cabinets, overturning parts trays, pouring cans of motor oil across the floor, across the walls, across the workbench. They didn't take anything. It wasn't theft. They had come to destroy, to send a message. Conrad knew who that message was from. He took Tessa by the hand, pulled her into the corner of the room, and signaled for silence. They sat in the dark until the sound of an engine starting out on the street faded, and everything went still. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the sky began to pale. Tessa stepped out of the back room and looked. The front glass door had been shattered, pieces of glass scattered across the floor, glittering under the streetlight spilling in from outside. The main tool cabinet had been knocked sideways, wrenches, screwdrivers, and trays of bolts scattered all over the floor. Motor oil had spread into black puddles across the cement, mixing with broken glass. The workbench had one leg smashed off and lay tilted to one side. The large air compressor had its hose crushed flat. Bay 2 and Bay 3 were no better. Everything overturned, thrown, spilled. Tessa stood in the middle of the garage and looked around, looked at the place Old Man Hargrove had left her, the place she had kept alive for 4 years with her own 2 hands, the place one stranger had once paid $35,000 to keep her from losing. She stood there, both hands hanging at her sides, not crying, not speaking. She only stood and looked. Conrad stepped out behind her. He saw everything Tessa saw. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "This is my fault." Both things were true, but saying them wouldn't lift a single shard of glass off the floor. He took off his jacket, draped it over a chair, walked to the corner of Bay 1, picked up the first wrench he saw on the floor, and began cleaning. Tessa looked at him. Then she picked up a broom, and the two of them began. From 5 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. 9 hours. The two of them cleaned the garage without saying more than 10 sentences, picking up glass, sweeping the floor, wiping oil, setting the cabinets upright, sorting the tools back into place, repairing the workbench, replacing the broken door glass with a temporary sheet of plywood. Conrad's hand bled twice from cuts made by glass, and he wrapped it with a rag and kept working. Tessa dragged the tool cabinet, which weighed twice as much as she did, back into its old position by herself, centimeter by centimeter, without asking Conrad to help. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the garage looked like a garage again, not as good as before, but standing, working, alive. That evening, Conrad sat on the back step of the garage, looking out at the small parking lot behind it. The yellow streetlight shone in, revealing a shard of broken glass he had missed while sweeping, glittering on the asphalt. He looked at that piece of glass for a long time. He thought about Grant. Not about the night of the takeover. Not about the shot, but about the choice Grant had made. To destroy the garage of a woman who fixed cars in the suburbs of Baltimore. A woman who had nothing to do with it. A woman who had no place in any war between Conrad and Grant. Grant had destroyed this garage because Conrad was here, and that was how Grant sent his message. No one who stood beside Conrad was safe. Conrad's father had once said, "We control the root, not people." That principle had another side his father never needed to say aloud, because it was obvious. Never touch the uninvolved. That was the line the Mercer family had never crossed in 3 generations, and Grant had just crossed it. Not because Grant needed to destroy this garage, but because Grant thought he had the right. Conrad looked at the shard of glass on the asphalt. 4 years earlier, he had saved this garage with $35,000, with 1 note in a bank file, with money. Anyone could give money. But now he had no money left, no men left, no organization left. All he had was a hard drive in a safe, inside a self-storage unit, a mind that remembered every money route he had built, and a decision he had just made while sitting there, staring at a shard of broken glass. He was going to save this garage another way. 3 days after the night the garage was wrecked, Pierce Alderman drove his dark blue 1968 Mustang to Hargrove Garage, the way he did every month. He was a regular customer, the kind who brought his classic car in for maintenance exactly on schedule. Never late, never haggling, paying in cash, then sitting at the reception counter reading the newspaper while Tessa worked. He was 58 years old, gray-haired, wearing metal-framed glasses, dressed like a retired college professor. But Pierce Alderman wasn't a professor. He had once been a federal prosecutor who specialized in organized crime, and in 15 years in that position, he had looked into the eyes of enough people on the other side of the table to know the difference between someone dangerous and someone pretending to be dangerous. That day, when he parked in front of the garage and walked in, he saw a man lying under a car in Bay 2, replacing the brakes. He saw the shoes first, and then, when the man slid out on the creeper board to get another wrench, Pierce saw his face. Pierce stopped. He knew that face. Not because he knew him personally, but because in 15 years as a prosecutor, he had studied the Mercer family files closely enough to remember every face across 3 generations. Conrad Mercer, Edmund's son, the head of Mercer Maritime Holdings. The man Pierce had never been able to gather enough evidence to bring to trial, and now he was lying under a car in a garage outside Baltimore, changing brakes, hands stained with oil, wearing a mechanic's shirt. Pierce said nothing that day. He let Tessa service the Mustang, paid her, and drove away. But all the way home, he thought, Conrad Mercer wasn't changing brakes in a garage because he enjoyed fixing cars. Something very big had happened. The following week, Pierce came back. This time, he didn't bring the car. He came by taxi. He walked into the garage, went straight to the reception counter, and set an envelope down in front of Tessa. Inside the envelope was a business card. "Your new mechanic is in bigger trouble than you think. If he wants to talk, this is my number." Tessa looked at the envelope, looked at Pierce, then looked toward Bay 2, where Conrad was working. She didn't open the envelope. She placed it under the counter. That night, she gave the envelope to Conrad. He opened it, read the name on the business card, then set it down. No. The next week, Tessa brought it up again. Conrad said no a second time. He didn't trust lawyers. He didn't trust anyone from the old world. He had called 14 numbers and no one had picked up, and that lesson was enough to make him not want to speak to anyone else. But Tessa looked at him. Looked at the way he sat on the back step every evening, staring at the piece of broken glass. Looked at the way he had installed the locks with his hand gripping so hard the skin had peeled. Looked at the way he had decided something but had no way to carry it out. And she said, "You can sit here changing oil for the rest of your life, or you can go talk to that old man and come back to change oil afterward." Conrad looked at her. Then he took the business card, put it in his pocket, and went. But before going to Pierce's office, he needed one thing. He asked Tessa to drive him to a self-storage facility in the northern suburbs of Baltimore. The kind people rented by the month, paid for in cash, and didn't need a real ID to secure. Conrad had rented that unit 5 years earlier under a false name, a safety habit his father had taught him. Always have one place no one knows about, not even the person closest to you. Inside the storage unit was a small safe. Inside the safe was a portable hard drive. On the hard drive were all the financial records of Mercer Maritime Holdings from the moment Conrad took over. Contracts, transfers, ledgers, partner lists, shipping routes, everything. Conrad took the hard drive. Tessa drove him to Pierce's office. She didn't ask what was inside it. Pierce's office was on the 3rd floor of an old building in downtown Baltimore, a small room with law books packed on the shelves and the smell of cold coffee in the air. Pierce plugged the hard drive into his computer, opened file after file, and read page after page. He read in silence. No questions, no comments, just reading, scrolling, opening the next file, reading more. 10 minutes, 20 minutes. Then he stopped, took off his glasses, set them on the desk, and looked at Conrad. "This isn't just betrayal. This is a setup." Conrad sat across from him, his expression unchanged. "Grant didn't just overthrow you. He framed you. On paper, you're the head of the entire operation. Every contract for transporting illegal cargo carries your signature. Every account receiving the money is in your name. You weren't only removed from power. You were arranged to take the fall for him." Conrad didn't panic, didn't stand, didn't curse. He sat still for 30 seconds, looking at Pierce's computer screen, where a spreadsheet was open, crowded with rows of numbers and company names. Then he asked his first question. "The money route from Mercer Maritime into the shell companies? Which bank did it pass through?" Pierce looked at him, slightly surprised, then went back through the file. "First Federal in Delaware." "Wrong," Conrad said. "First Federal is the official route I set up. If Grant moved money under the table, he wouldn't use a route I built. He would open his own. Look for transactions that didn't go through First Federal, but passed through another bank. That's Grant's money, not mine." Pierce flipped through the file. Searched. Correct. There was a chain of transactions through a small bank in Maryland that Pierce had overlooked. The second question. 7 shell companies. I only know 3 of them because they're part of the system I built. Grant created the other 4 himself. Check the incorporation dates. All of them will be after March 3 years ago, because that was when Grant began moving. Any company formed before that date is mine. Any company formed after that date is his. Pierce checked. Correct. 4 companies had been created starting in May 3 years earlier. The third question. The illegal cargo contracts carry my signature, but I'm left-handed. Check the slant of the signatures on those contracts. If they lean right, they're forged. Pierce leaned back in his chair. He looked at Conrad Mercer, the man sitting across from him in an oil-stained mechanic's shirt, and he understood why this man had run an empire for 8 years. Not because he had more money, not because he had more men, but because he saw structure faster than anyone else in the room, even a former federal prosecutor who had spent 20 minutes reading the files and still hadn't seen what Conrad saw in 30 seconds. 2 weeks after the first meeting, Pierce called Conrad at 10 o'clock at night. His voice was different. It no longer had the slow, measured tone of a lawyer analyzing a problem. His voice was tight, urgent, the voice of a man trying to stay calm, while the news itself wasn't calm at all. "Come to my office right now." Conrad arrived in 20 minutes. Tessa drove. When he stepped into the office, Pierce was standing beside his desk, not sitting, his hand still holding the phone he had just hung up. "Grant made his second move," Pierce said. "He sent the FBI a complete set of files. Illegal cargo transport contracts with your signature, bank accounts in your name receiving money from illegal transactions, and internal meeting minutes bearing the Mercer Maritime seal with you presiding over them. All of it is fake. But it's carefully fake, built from your real signature, in old company records, copied and pasted onto new contracts. My source inside the FBI says they're processing the file, and they're coming to arrest you. Conrad stood in the middle of the office, looking at Pierce. How long? 72 hours. Maybe sooner. Grant's file is enough to put you behind bars for 20 years. We have to submit the real evidence to the prosecutors before the fake file becomes an indictment. 72 hours. 3 days. Conrad had spent 8 years building an empire, spent 6 months losing everything, and now he had 3 days to prove he wasn't the criminal Grant was painting him to be. He sat down in the chair across from Pierce, silent. 30 seconds. Pierce waited. Tessa stood by the office door, her back against the wall, waiting. Then Conrad pulled a blank sheet of paper from Pierce's desk toward him, took a pen, and began to draw. He drew a diagram. 7 rectangles, each one a shell company, connected by arrows showing the direction of the money flow. He wrote the name of each company, each intermediary bank, each money route running from Mercer Maritime through the shell companies and out again. He drew it from memory, without opening the hard drive, without looking at a single file. Every box, every arrow, every name was exact, as if he were looking at the spreadsheet on a screen. Pierce watched the diagram grow on the page, line by line, and asked, "You remember all of this?" "I'm the one who built that system," Conrad said, his eyes never leaving the paper. "Grant only copied it. And when he copied it, he made 3 mistakes I'd never make. The first mistake, Grant used the same small bank in Maryland for all 7 shell companies. Conrad would never let 2 companies use the same bank, because if investigators found one, it would pull out all the rest. Grant gathered everything in one place, because it was convenient. And because it was convenient, he exposed the whole structure. The second mistake, 4 of the 7 shell companies had been formed in the same month, by the same law firm, with the same registered address in Delaware. Conrad set up shell companies across different years, different states, and different lawyers. Grant created 4 in 1 month because he was rushing, and that hurry was like leaving 4 fingers on the same fingerprint. The third mistake, Grant's money route went straight from the shell company accounts into the personal accounts of the regional chiefs he had bought off. The bribe money sat naked in the books, unwashed, untreated. Conrad would never leave a direct trace between organization money and personal money. Grant left it there because he thought no one would ever check, because he thought Conrad was dead or would never come back. Pierce looked at the diagram, looked at the 3 points Conrad had just circled in red pen. He began building the rebuttal file, using data from Conrad's hard drive, combined with the 3 structural weaknesses Conrad had pointed out. Hour 12. Hour 24. Pierce wrote, read, compared, rewrote. Conrad sat across from him, answering every question about the financial structure, the process, the way the system operated. Tessa sat in the corner of the office, on a folding chair beside the shelves of law books, silent. She didn't understand financial records. She didn't know how to read a money flow diagram. She sat there because Conrad needed someone to drive, and because she didn't want to be alone at the garage anymore after the night of the wrench. Hour 48. Pierce was typing the final summary. Conrad was checking the files on the hard drive again. The room was quiet, with only the sound of the keyboard and pages turning. Then Tessa spoke. 1 word. Signature. Pierce stopped typing. Conrad looked up. Tessa was looking at the stack of fake documents Pierce had printed from the FBI packet his source had passed along. The stack had been sitting on the side table beside her for 2 days, and she had flipped through a few pages while she waited. "The signatures on these pages," Tessa said, pointing at the contract bearing Conrad's signature. "They lean the wrong way." Pierce looked at her. "How do you know?" "I've fixed cars for 8 years. Every customer signs the vehicle release form. I look at signatures every day, hundreds of them. And I know a right-handed person's signature leans differently from a left-handed person's." She pointed at Conrad. "The first time he signed a form at my garage, the pen was on the right side of the counter. He reached across, moved the pen to his left hand, and then signed. A left-handed person's signature leans left. The strokes pull from the right. Completely different. The signatures on these contracts lean right. Whoever signed these papers was right-handed." The room went still. Pierce stood, walked to the side table, picked up the contract, and looked at the signature. It leaned right. He went to the main desk, opened a file on the hard drive, found an old contract with Conrad's real signature. It leaned left. He placed the 2 pages side by side. One leaned right, one leaned left. Grant had copied Conrad's signature, but he hadn't copied the direction of his hand. He hadn't copied the physical habit of a left-handed man. He had used a right-handed person to forge the signature, and that mistake sat there in every stroke of the pen. Pierce took off his glasses, set them on the desk, and looked at Tessa. Tessa was still sitting on the folding chair, hands resting on her thighs, her face as ordinary as if she had just said the weather was nice today. "You just broke this case," Pierce said. Tessa said nothing. She only looked at Conrad. He looked back at her, and for the first time since he had been lying on the concrete floor of that warehouse that night, Conrad Mercer had something like a smile at the corner of his mouth. Not a happy smile. The smile of a man who had just realized that the thing saving his life wasn't a hard drive, wasn't a lawyer, but a mechanic who knew how to see the slant of a signature, because she had looked at hundreds of them every day for 8 years. That night, after Pierce completed the file and sent it to the federal prosecutor, Conrad returned to the garage at 1 o'clock in the morning. Tessa was asleep. Cody was asleep on the folding chair in the corner of Bay 1, the place he had claimed for himself on the first night, and no one had said a word about it. The garage was quiet, with only the old air conditioner humming steadily and the streetlight spilling through the plywood panel that had replaced the glass door. Conrad didn't sleep. He sat on the back step, looking out at the parking lot, thinking. Pierce had said the FBI would move in another 48 hours. The rebuttal file had been submitted. The forged signatures had been exposed. The 3 structural weaknesses had been pointed out. Legally, the work was done. But there was one thing that wasn't done. That thing wasn't in any file, wasn't on any lawyer's desk, wasn't in any call between Pierce and the prosecutor. That thing was between Conrad and Grant. 20 years. They had grown up together. 2 families living side by side. 2 children playing in the same yard, eating at the same table during holidays. Conrad had taught Grant how to drive. Grant had been the best man at Conrad's wedding. When Conrad's father died, Grant stood beside him at the cemetery, his eyes red, as if he had lost his own father. 20 years. And Grant had used every bit of that time to learn where to strike with the most precision. Conrad knew that every Thursday, Grant went to warehouse number 6 at the Port of Baltimore at 10 o'clock at night to inspect the southern cargo route. An old habit, from when Grant was still his right hand. Grant hadn't changed that habit because Grant thought Conrad no longer had the ability to cause any kind of problem. Thursday, 11 o'clock at night, Conrad stood up from the back step, took the pickup truck keys, and went out. He didn't tell Pierce, didn't tell Tessa, didn't tell anyone, because this wasn't a matter of law. This was a matter between 2 men who had once called each other brothers. He drove out of the garage and turned left at the end of the street. Tessa opened her eyes. She heard the engine start, heard the tires on the asphalt, heard the engine fade into the distance. She lay still on the folding cot in the back room, looking up at the ceiling, and knew exactly where he was going. She knew because she had lived beside Conrad long enough to understand the way he sat on the back step every night. On nights when he was thinking about the file, he sat with his head lowered. On nights when he was thinking about Wyatt, he sat looking up at the sky. Tonight, he had sat with his back straight, looking straight ahead, and that was how he sat when he had already made his decision. She didn't get up to stop him. She didn't call. Some things needed to be ended by standing face to face one last time, and Tessa understood that because she, too, had things she wished she had been allowed to say one final word to before they were taken from her. Warehouse number 6, Port of Baltimore. Midnight. Conrad parked Tessa's pickup truck 200 meters from the warehouse gate and walked in. The gate wasn't locked, and the lights inside were already on. Grant was here. Conrad pushed open the warehouse door and stepped inside. The warehouse hadn't changed. The same long table in the middle, the same chairs set around it, and on the concrete floor, 6 steps from the door, there was still a dark stain no one had cleaned. That stain was Conrad's. The night he fell, the night he crawled toward the door, blood from his left shoulder had soaked through his shirt and left a mark on the floor. No one had cleaned it. Maybe because no one had noticed. Maybe because Grant wanted to keep it there, like a trophy. Conrad looked at the stain. Then he stepped over it. Grant was sitting at the head of the table, in the chair Conrad had occupied for 8 years. 4 bodyguards stood on either side. Grant was looking over papers, and when he heard footsteps, he lifted his head. When he saw Conrad, his eyes widened for 1 second, then narrowed again. He didn't panic. He was surprised. the kind of surprise a man feels when he sees a piece he has swept off the board walk back onto it by itself. "What are you doing here? Coming to beg for your chair back?" Conrad didn't sit. He stood 3 steps from the table, close enough to see Grant's face clearly, far enough that the 4 bodyguards didn't feel threatened. He looked around the warehouse, looked at every corner, every wall, the stacked crates in the back, the long table, the chairs. He looked at it as if he were seeing it for the last time, because that was exactly what it was. After tonight, this warehouse would no longer belong to Grant. After tonight, many things would no longer belong to Grant. "I didn't come to beg," Conrad said. His voice was flat, slow, every word clear. The voice 8 years at the head of the table had forged in him. "I came so you could look at my face. So later, when you're sitting in a room 3 square meters wide, you'll remember which face stood here today." Grant looked at Conrad. Then he smiled. A broad, confident smile. The smile of a man sitting at the head of the table with 4 bodyguards, thinking the man standing in front of him had nothing left. But Grant didn't answer. That smile stayed on his face, but his mouth didn't open again. There are things people can't answer. Not because they have no words, but because instinct tells them what they've just heard isn't a threat. It is goodbye. And goodbye doesn't need a reply. Conrad turned around, walked away, crossed the dark stain on the floor a second time, went out through the warehouse door, 6 steps, just like that night. But that night he had crawled. Tonight he walked, back straight, steps even, no looking back. The 4 bodyguards looked at one another. No one stopped him. Not because Grant ordered them to let him go. Grant said nothing at all. But because there are some people who, when they turn their back and walk out, instinct tells you that you shouldn't be the person standing between them and the door, even when you have a gun and they're empty-handed. Conrad drove the pickup truck back to the garage, parked in the same old spot, entered through the back door. Tessa was lying on the cot, eyes open, looking up at the ceiling. She heard him come in. She didn't ask. He didn't speak. He lay down on the folding cot, looked up at the ceiling, and for the first time in months, he fell asleep before 2 o'clock in the morning. 48 hours later, the FBI came to warehouse number 6. The FBI raided warehouse number 6 at 5 o'clock on Saturday morning. At the same time, other federal teams moved on 7 different locations along the East Coast, from Norfolk to Newark. Exactly the 7 points Conrad had circled on the diagram in Pierce's office. Grant Hale was arrested at the warehouse, sitting at the head of the table, in the very chair Conrad had stood across from 2 days earlier. 11 federal charges: money laundering, financial fraud, transporting illegal cargo, forging documents, and more. The 8 regional chiefs were arrested that same day. The 8 men who had once sat around the table the night Conrad was removed. The 8 men who hadn't stood. The 8 men who hadn't looked at him. Now all 8 of them were looking down at the floor again. But this time, the floor was the floor of a federal prisoner transport van. During the investigation, the FBI traced the trust fund Delaney Cross had set up with Grant 2 years before Conrad was overthrown. The money in the trust came from transactions Grant had routed through the shell companies. Delaney was subpoenaed. Her law license was suspended immediately. She looked for a defense attorney. The first one refused after reading the file. The second refused after 1 phone call. The third didn't answer. Delaney sold the penthouse to pay her legal fees. Friends stopped calling. Former clients stopped calling. The phone of Delaney Cross, the woman whose schedule had once been packed from morning until night, was now as quiet as Conrad's phone had been 6 months earlier, when 14 numbers hadn't picked up. Pierce called Conrad at noon on Saturday to tell him the news. Conrad listened, said, "Thank you," then hung up. He sat on the plastic chair in bay 1 of the garage, holding the wrench he had been using that morning to replace the shock absorbers on a Corolla. He looked at the wrench, looked at the motor oil on his hands. Not happy, not satisfied, no feeling of victory. The Mercer empire had fallen, both the part he had built and the part Grant had destroyed. 3 generations, beginning with his father's small fleet of trucks at the port of Boston, ending here, in a garage outside Baltimore, in the hands of a mechanic holding a wrench and looking toward the door. He set the wrench down, slid beneath the Corolla, and kept working. 2 weeks after Grant was arrested, Pierce called Conrad to his office. It wasn't about the criminal case. It was about assets. Mercer Maritime Holdings, the legal part of the empire, still existed on paper. Warehouses, shipping contracts, trucking fleets, port operating licenses. The illegal portion had been seized by the FBI, but the clean portion still belonged to Conrad because his name was still on the founding documents from his father's time. However, after the scandal, no partner wanted to work with the Mercer name anymore. Contracts were canceled. Clients walked away. The value of the company fell to the bottom. Pierce found a large logistics corporation in Philadelphia, willing to buy the entire legal portion, but at a price many times lower than its true value. After debts, legal fees, and liquidation costs were deducted, Conrad was left with $3.5 million. $3.5 million from an empire that had once been worth hundreds of millions. Clean money. The last inheritance his father had left behind, compressed into a number just large enough to begin again, but never large enough to return. Conrad signed the sale papers on a Wednesday afternoon, in Pierce's office, with his left hand. The pen leaned left, like every real signature of his. After he signed, he set the pen down, looked at the paper, and knew he had just signed the final line that would ever carry the name Mercer Maritime. 3 generations, beginning with his father's fleet of 3 trucks, ending with one signature on a lawyer's desk. He folded the copy, put it in his pocket, and drove back to the garage. That evening, he sat with Tessa at the reception counter after closing. Cody had gone back to the sleeping room. The garage was quiet, with only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Conrad said, "I want to use that money to expand this garage. Build an upstairs floor for classrooms. Buy new equipment. Turn it into an auto repair trade training center. Take in foster kids, former inmates, people nobody gives a chance to. Teach them a trade. Give them a place to stand." Tessa didn't answer right away. She sat on the old swivel chair at the counter, both hands resting on her thighs, looking at Conrad. Then she said, "No." Conrad looked at her. "The last time you gave me money, I didn't know who you were. I kept this garage alive for 4 years with my own 2 hands. I changed every oil filter, mopped every floor, fixed every car, paid every electric bill with my own labor. If you pour money into it now, it won't be my garage anymore. It'll be your garage with me standing inside it." She didn't say it angrily. She didn't say it sadly. Her voice was level, the voice of someone who had thought carefully before opening her mouth. This wasn't a girl refusing money out of pride. This was a woman who had kept a garage alive for 4 years with her own 2 hands and wouldn't accept anyone taking that ownership from her, not even through kindness. Conrad sat still for a while. Then he said, "Then it's yours. The papers stay in your name. The decisions are yours. I only contribute money to build the classrooms and buy the equipment. If you ever want to throw me out, I'll go." Tessa looked at him for a long time. She looked into the eyes of the man who had once sat at the head of the table and commanded an entire empire. And now he was sitting here, in her garage, saying, "If you want to throw me out, I'll go," and meaning it. She thought about what to name the center. Not after herself. Not after Conrad. She thought about Old Man Hargrove, the man who had given her her first job when she was 19 years old, fresh out of the system, with nothing but 2 hands and a willingness to do any work put in front of her. He taught her how to fix cars. He taught her how to stop bleeding. He taught her how to look at a broken machine and not be afraid. And when he died, he left the garage to her, not because of a will, but because there was no one else, and because he knew she would keep it. "Hargrove," Tessa said. "The center's name is Hargrove Trade Center." Conrad nodded. He didn't ask why. He knew Old Man Hargrove from the stories Tessa told when the 2 of them were lying beneath cars. From the way she said, "Mr. Hargrove taught me whenever she showed Conrad a new technique, from the way she kept this garage as if she were holding the last thing someone had ever left for her." Neither of them named it after themselves. Both of them named it after the person who had given them their first chance. Old Man Mercer gave Conrad principles and an empire. Old Man Hargrove gave Tessa a wrench and a roof. And now, those 2 names came together in a trade training center outside Baltimore. The lower floor, a garage and practice workshop. The upper floor, classrooms and a career counseling office. 12 seats in the first class, reserved for people the world had turned its back on. 3 months of construction. Tessa managed everything. Conrad helped. Cody was the first student to register. ID number 0001. 1 month after Hargrove Trade Center opened, the Baltimore County Court reviewed custody rights for Wyatt Mercer. Delaney was under investigation. Her law license was suspended, and her assets were frozen. the court decided to grant Conrad visitation with his son, beginning that weekend. On the first Saturday afternoon, Conrad stood in the parking lot in front of the center, waiting. The temporary guardian's car pulled up. The door opened. Wyatt stepped down, 5 years old, a small backpack on his shoulders, his shoelaces tied unevenly, the left one looser than the right. The little boy saw his father and ran. He didn't call his name, didn't ask why. He only ran, on the short legs of a 5-year-old child, running across the parking lot, running straight into Conrad. Conrad dropped to his knees, both knees touching the asphalt, and held his son. His left arm was still weak from the wound in his shoulder, but he held him with both arms. He didn't say anything. Wyatt didn't say anything either. The boy only buried his face in his father's neck, both hands gripping his shirt tightly, the way children hold on only when they're afraid of being let go. Tessa stood in the doorway of the center, looking out at the parking lot. She saw Conrad kneeling on the asphalt, holding the 5-year-old child, and she remembered the Polaroid in the tin box, the picture of her holding Cody when he was 2 years old, one of his hands gripping her collar. The same kind of grip, the same fear of being let go. 3 months later, the first graduating class of Hargrove Trade Center held its ceremony. 8 students stood in a line in front of the practice workshop, each one holding a new wrench set, a professional boxed wrench set, the graduation gift Tessa had chosen one by one. 8 people, 2 former inmates, 3 young people from juvenile facilities, 2 people who had lost their jobs and couldn't get hired anywhere, and Cody. Cody stood forth from the left, his back straight, the wrench set in his hands, his eyes looking forward. Wyatt sat on Cody's shoulders, both hands gripping Cody's forehead, laughing, clapping every time someone said something, even though he didn't understand what it meant. The 5-year-old child sat on the shoulders of the 21-year-old young man, both of them once torn away from the people they loved, and now they were here, in the front yard of a trade training center, named after an old mechanic who was gone. Tessa stood behind the row of students, arms folded across her chest, biting her lip. She looked at Cody, the younger brother she had searched for 12 years, the little boy she had once watched through a window as the car drove away, now standing here, holding a wrench, with a trade, with a place to stand. She bit her lip harder. That was how Tessa Moran held back tears. Conrad stood in front of the students. He didn't hold any paper. He hadn't prepared a speech. He looked at the 8 faces, then said, 4 years ago, someone fixed my car for me at midnight and didn't ask a single question. Today, you're graduating because someone believed you were worth a chance. Go out there and become the next person who gives someone a chance. He said nothing more. He walked toward Tessa, stood beside her, and together they looked at the line of 8 students holding their new wrenches. Wyatt clapped from Cody's shoulders. Cody smiled, the kind of smile Tessa had never seen on his face in the 3 years he had lived with her. Inside the center's reception room, on the wall behind the counter, 2 things hung beside each other. On the left was an old black and white photograph of Old Man Hargrove standing in front of the garage in 1992, holding a wrench, smiling, beside the first car he had ever fixed in that garage. On the right was a printed screenshot from a phone, framed behind a small piece of glass. On it was a banknote from 4 years earlier. A garage worth keeping. A mechanic worth remembering. 2 pictures beside each other. One old mechanic who had given an orphaned girl her first chance. One strange man who had paid $35,000 so she wouldn't lose that chance. And now, that girl was standing in front of 8 people, giving them the same kind of chance she had once been given. The story of Conrad Mercer and Tessa Moran wasn't a story about money. It wasn't a story about power. It was a story about who stays when you've lost everything. The people who leave when you have nothing left were never truly beside you. The people who stay don't stay because they owe you. They stay because they know exactly what it feels like to lie in the dark with no one in the world knowing where you are. A second chance doesn't come from money. It comes from someone willing to open a garage door at 2 o'clock in the morning. If this story touched you, please hit the like button so more people can hear it. Share this video with someone who once helped you without asking for anything in return. They deserve to know that you still remember. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe now so you don't miss the next stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment and share what's deep in your heart. We read every line and treasure every word you send us. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.